When we talk about God betraying a narcissist, it's not betrayal in the traditional sense. God does not betray anyone. His nature is love, truth, and justice. But for a narcissist who operates entirely on pride, manipulation, and self interest, divine justice feels like betrayal. That is what it is. What happens to a narcissist isn't God turning his back on them, it is the consequences of their own actions. It is how they set themselves up for what feels like divine betrayal by going against everything good, true, and sacred. Hi, I am Danish. The topic for today's episode is 2 ways God betrays a narcissist for betraying you. Today's episode is very important because I will share a lot of my personal experiences, so stay until the very end. Before we get started, here is an update for you. The program on how to overcome betrayal trauma after narcissistic abuse in 5 steps is live at an early bird price for the first 100 participants. If you want to get instant access, click the I button above or the link in the description of this episode. Number 1. He turns their world upside down through crushing disappointment. There is nothing quite like seeing a narcissist experience real, raw disappointment for the first time. For years, they have lived under the illusion that they can control outcomes, manipulate circumstances, and bend reality to their will. But you and I both know God has a way of pulling the rug out from under them when they least expect it, leaving them feeling helpless and hopeless in a way they have never felt before. Let me share a personal experience with you. You know my father was a malignant narcissist. He worked his entire life with a single dream in mind, building his dream home. He was meticulous, obsessive, even about how it should be constructed. He hoarded money, making sacrifices, of course he did, along the way, and when the time came, he was very clear with the workers about every single detail, every measurement, every plan, every instruction. It was all spelled out to perfection, or so he thought. When the house was finished, it was nothing short of a nightmare. The room sizes were all wrong. The roof heights were bizarrely uneven. It wasn't just disappointing, it was devastating, especially for him. This was supposed to be the crown jewel of his life's work, the thing that symbolized his success and control. Instead, it became a symbol of his helplessness. I remember him sitting on his prayer mat, crying out loud to God, praying for the workers' destruction. Imagine the kind of internal collapse it takes for a man who thought he controlled everything to finally feel so powerless. That is the thing. God doesn't betray them. He lets their own pride and actions lead them to situations that reflect the truth they have avoided their whole lives. It reminds me of Shaddad, the ruler who thought he could create his own paradise on earth. I have narrated this story before. He worked tirelessly to build it, filling it with everything he thought would make him immortal in the eyes of the world. But the moment he was about to enter it, he died. He never got to taste the very thing he spent his entire life building. Can you imagine that? This is how God works. He allows narcissists to build their castles of pride only to let them crumble when they are about to reach the pinnacle. Not as an act of betrayal, but as a lesson, ones they often refuse to learn. The disappointment isn't just about the failure itself. It is about stripping them of the illusion that they are in control, forcing them to confront the reality that they're not God, no matter how much they pretend to be. Number 2, he takes away their biggest and most reliable source of support. If there is one thing a narcissist counts on, it's having a reliable source of supply. You know that, don't you? This could be a person, a relationship, or even a role in life that gives them validation, power, or control. But God has a way of removing this lifeline when the time is right. Again, one more story of my grandfather. My father was the golden child of his father, my late grandfather. For years, he was the apple of his father's eye, the one who could do no wrong. My grandfather poured all his affection, trust, and hope into my father, relying on him for emotional and financial support. He was really money oriented. But something shifted. A time came when my father stopped caring as much. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was resentment, maybe it was his narcissism. Whatever the reason, the dynamic changed. Suddenly, my grandfather found himself without the unconditional support he had always relied on. The effect was catastrophic. My grandfather couldn't cope with the loss of attention and care. He began crying, literally, and wailing to anyone who would listen, lamenting how his son had abandoned him, even though he had 4 more sons. But none of them was like my father. He was inconsolable. And I think that's when his downfall began. The golden child he had relied on so heavily no longer saw him in the same way. And that loss of control triggered a mini collapse that I think he never recovered from. This is something God does to narcissists always. He doesn't actively take things away from them. No, He allows their own actions to create the conditions for loss. When they neglect or exploit their sources of support, when they assume that loyalty and devotion are guaranteed no matter how they behave, they set themselves up for disappointment. The loss of their most reliable source, whether it is a golden child, a scapegoat, a partner, or even their position of power, feels like betrayal to them. They cannot process the idea that someone or something they relied on so heavily no longer serves them. But it's not betrayal. It is the inevitable result of their own behavior. God's justice is often subtle but devastatingly precise. By removing their greatest source of supply, He forces them to confront the emptiness within. They are left floundering, unable to rely on the things that once propped up their ego. If you're watching a narcissist go through this right now, remember, it's not your job to save them or shield them from the consequences of their actions. I tried and failed. Their reckoning is between them and God. You cannot come in between. And if you have been hurt by a narc, take comfort in knowing that the universe always balances the scales. I firmly believe that. God's justice might not come when or how we expect it, but it's always there, unfolding in ways we may not immediately see. These stories and truths remind us that no one is above divine law, not even those who think they can manipulate the world to their will. And in the end, truth always wins. Always. With that, let's bring this episode to an end. I hope you enjoyed this one. Let me know in the comments, and I will talk to you in the next one. Until then, as always, let the healing begin and continue.